Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is a module on language contact as part of the course Introduction to Linguistics. I am your course teacher for this module. I am Anish Koshi. I teach at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. In this module, we would like to acquaint you with the concept of language contact and the results and consequences of language contact. Let us start with a rudimentary understanding of what language contact means. While you might have already guessed from the term itself what language contact means, in theoretical literature, language contact basically means when speakers of different languages come in contact with each other. Thus, though we call the term as language contact, the term actually refers to the contact that happens between speakers of multiple languages. Now, this must be happening in particular geographical areas. So speakers usually that are taken into consideration are speakers who can remain in contact for some sustained period of time, though that is not necessarily part of the definition. Thus, the concept of language contact covers from the most superficial forms of contact between speakers of different languages to the most intense kinds of contact that we can come across. The superficial kind of contact that we are referring to would be the contact that happens between, say, traders who would meet on particular market days and would have to exchange a few words related to their trade and thus talk to each other for the bare minimum amount of time with the bare minimum amount of language required. The most intense types of contact would be where speakers of different languages live in the same geographical vicinity and are possibly required to talk to each other, to communicate with each other, ideas, exchange items with each other, and have to live with each other using possibly each other's language, or as it happens in many different contexts of language contact, develop or use a third form of language. Now, language contact is therefore a very integral part of studying what happens to a language, because language contact represents an external factor that leads to language change and also a factor that happens to affect the vitality and survival of many languages. In other modules on language change, you have already seen how languages may change internally due to factors like analogy, where speakers of languages see that there are certain rules which are irregular in nature and try to regularize them. The most striking example being that of the ed past affix that we have already discussed in our unit on language change. Thus, language contact represents an external factor that could lead to change. Now, in this juncture, it is important for us to consider what are the important issues that ensue when we are talking about situations of language contact. The most rudimentary issues would be what actually happens when languages come into contact. What kind of changes are observed in the languages that come into contact? Do languages come into contact on an equal footing? Are there factors of economic prestige or government patronage or even social prestige or religious prestige that is carried by one of the languages in the situation of contact, and that has some kind of an influence on the other languages in contact? Let us take briefly the examples of two scenarios. Let us look at a colonial scenario. We know that in most colonial situations, what happens is that the language of the colonizer is deemed more prestigious than the language of the colonized, or if you want to use the word, vanquished. So if you look globally, it is not merely the presence of English and the kind of influence that English has had on Indian languages, but globally we see, for example, the the presence and the role of French in many African countries. We see the role and presence of Spanish in many Latin American countries. We see the presence and role of Russian in many Central Asian countries. And in most of these situations, even after the colonizers have left, the language of the colonizers have retained a place of prestige in the societies. The other situation that ensues in situations of contact is what happens when there are certain languages with government patronage. Look at the situation in India. There are more than 1,500 mother tongues registered according to our own 2001 Census of India. Of these 1,500 mother tongues, only 22 languages find a place in the Constitution of India as official languages to be used by the Union of India or by the state governments. Now you can easily imagine what happens when these 22 languages are spoken in areas where there are lesser known languages or lesser privileged languages spoken. Think about the situation of a tribal child in Jharkhand speaking a language like Mundari or Santhali or Kurukh, now also faced with a situation where their own mother tongue has no prestige in the society and Hindi appears as a dominant language because of the state patronage that Hindi enjoys. So, as far as the tribal child is concerned, speaking his or her own language seems to provide no necessary economic advantage, whereas learning a language like Hindi would provide the child with greater opportunities of employment, greater opportunities to participate in different avenues of the government. Thus, we can see very clearly that when languages come into contact, they very rarely do so in situations of equality. Most of the times, we have a dominant language and we have a language or languages that are dominated, and thus language contact situations very often result in a detrimental effect on the vitality and survival of most of these dominated languages. However, in the theory of language contact, we talk about three different kinds of influences that situations of contact can have, known by the terms ad stratum influence, substratum influence, and superstratum influence. Perchance, if two languages can meet and meet on an equal footing of prestige and equality, then we would say that both of them exert influence on each other, with no one language being negatively affected by the other. This would be a situation of ad stratum influence. To think of an example, think of the way probably speakers of Hindi and speakers of Gujarati or speakers of Telugu and speakers of Kannada are going to meet in today's scenario in India. They are not necessarily under any pressure to give up any aspect of their language, and anything that they borrow or lend would be on an equal footing. The same happens with most European languages today, with French giving many words to English and many French speakers borrowing many words from English. Though that was not the kind of influence that French had on English soon after the Norman conquest. French exerted an influence of superiority on English, with English speakers finding it necessary to, if not speaking in French, using a lot of French words in their own vocabulary. This kind of influence, where one language exerts influence on the other, is known in the literature as superstratum influence. We can see this also in the Indian scenario, where many languages from the Dravidian family, which have nothing to do with Sanskrit, have borrowed many words from Sanskrit. You have words like Mahatvam, meaning importance. You have words like Saundaryam, meaning beauty, in the Dravidian languages, which have come via Sanskrit, where Sanskrit is not genetically linked to these languages. This has happened because Sanskrit has always enjoyed a position of prestige because of its use as a language of religion, as a sacred language of the scriptures. It has been able to exert a kind of influence where Many languages in India have borrowed words from Sanskrit freely for factors of prestige. This is an instance of superstratum influence in situations of language contact. Now you might be wondering, do we have the reverse situation? Yes, the reverse situation is known as substratum influence, where in mostly situations of colonial conquest, the language of the vanquished, even though replaced in many ways by the language of the conqueror, leaves behind a trace on the language of the conqueror. This has happened in the case, for example, of French. French, as opposed to English, has a vigesimal system of numerals, whereas English has a decimal system of numerals. Now, French and English are both Indo-European languages, and where did French get its vigesimal system? Vigesimal system of numeral means a system based on a base of 20. So, while in English you have 10, 20, 30, 40, etc., where 40 is 4 tenths and 80 is 8 tenths, in French you have 40 is equal to 2 20s and 80 is equal to 4 20s. This is a vigesimal system. Interestingly, French, it is believed, has got this vigesimal system as a result of a substratum influence after French conquered Celtic languages which had a vigesimal system. Now, when we talk about language contact, we also need to talk about the consequences of language contact on the languages. When languages are in contact for a long time, there is usually a lot of borrowing of lexical items to begin with, that is, borrowing of words to begin with. And with sustained contact, we see a borrowing of phonological as well as grammatical systems. This is what is known as linguistic acculturation, and this will form the part of our next module on linguistic acculturation and formation of linguistic areas. In this module, we would look at some of the other consequences that happen as a result of language contact. Now, as we mentioned earlier, when speakers of two mutually unintelligible languages come into contact with each other, they need to do something to be able to communicate with each other. What has happened globally in such situations of contact is that some form of a rudimentary language or a communication system is developed by the speakers in order to achieve this aim. Now, one of the first things that we would be discussing now would be what are called mixed languages. These are all different forms of what are known in the literature as contact languages, that is, languages or communication systems that are a product of sustained contact. Now, mixed languages are languages where we find features of two different languages being used in different domains of the language. As you can see, this is not the replacement of one language with the language of the colonizer or the dominating culture, but a mixture of two different systems that come about as a result of contact. Two very famous examples in the literature of mixed languages are Michif, spoken in Canada, and Ma, spoken in Tanzania. Michif is a mixed language which is based on French, which is an Indo-European language, and Cree, which is an Algonquian language. What we find in Michif, very interestingly, is that the nominal system in Michif is based on French, whereas the verbal system is based on Cree. And when we analyze the structure of Ma, spoken in Tanzania, we find a complete mixture of Cushitic languages, Bantu languages, with even Maasai words in it. Now, most of the times, situations of language contact do not result in such well-formed mixed languages. What we mostly find in situations of contact are forms of languages which are known in the literature as Pigeons and Creoles. Pigeons are rudimentary forms of language which develop in situations of contact where the most important basic vocabulary items that are required for communication are used by speakers of different languages. Thus, we have a very limited vocabulary of 1000 to 2000 words. Grammars are made simpler, many morphological systems are avoided, inflections are usually avoided. We find generally embedded structures missing. If there are alternations in the use of certain systems, those alternations are done away with. Thus, a very basic rudimentary system with a very basic vocabulary and a very basic grammar is made use of for communication. Now, in most of the pigeons that we know of have developed in situations of colonial conquest. Thus, we have globally many English-based pigeons, we have French-based pigeons, we have Portuguese-based pigeons, we have Spanish-based pigeons and the like. Even in India, Portuguese did not enjoy a longer period of stay in India as much did English, and we do find Portuguese-based pigeons spoken in regions of Daman and Diu. English also began its journey in India in the form of a pigeon, was known then very derisively as butler English because that was what it was meant for. The English master needed to communicate with his or her servant, and the servant, the butler, needed to speak back in very rudimentary English to his or her master. But butler English, of course, has now given way to what is today known as Indian English because of the adoption of English as one of the languages of India. The journey of pigeons in most parts of the world does not end with the stage of a pigeon. They develop into what are known as Creoles. Creoles are stages of pigeons where more vocabulary items are added to the communication system. Grammars are slightly elaborated based on probably the colonizer's language. But what we find is that whereas when the communication system or language exists in the form of a pigeon, there are hardly any speakers who would claim this pigeon as a mother tongue because they all have their own mother tongues and there is not much of a respect that is given to the pigeon. Whereas when the pigeon moves to the stage of a Creole, what we find is that there could be new speakers of the language who are now more proficient in using the Creole than probably using their own mother tongues. Very famous examples of Creoles around the world are that of the Hawaiian Creole and that of Tok Pisin spoken in Papua New Guinea. Tok Pisin today has developed or has been developed in such a way that it is even used in the news media as well as for parliamentary debates. Linguists have also spoken about a stage of such languages known as decreolization. So, the creation of pigeons from in situations of contact is known as pigeonization. The development of pigeons into Creoles is known as creolization. And linguists have also spoken about a third stage called decreolization. This is a stage where what was once a Creole is developed further into such a situation that the Creole is then considered a standalone variety of the standard language. This is the case with Black Vernacular English, which started its life as a pidgin used by the African slaves brought to the United States, developed into a stage of Creole, and today is the mother tongue of many speakers and is considered one of the major varieties like Indian English, and this would be a stage of decreolization. You might be wondering if we have any pigeons and Creoles in the Indian subcontinent. Yes, we do have pigeons in the Indian subcontinent, mostly two which are recorded in the literature, one called Nagamese spoken in Nagaland and the other called Sadhari spoken in Jharkhand. It is interesting that these pigeon forms have not come about as a result of colonial conquest. but as a result of speakers of different languages who do not understand each other's language having to talk to each other in mostly situations of trade and other forms of contact. Nagamese, as we said, is spoken in Nagaland. Nagaland is home to more than 20 different languages spoken by different tribal communities who use different forms of languages like Tenidie, Ao and Lotha, Sema and many others. Most of these languages are mutually unintelligible. These speakers of languages also exist in a situation of socio-cultural equality, which means that there is no pressure on speakers of one language to have to learn the language of the others. So what do they do when they have to talk to each other in the marketplace? What do they do when they have to talk in the classrooms? So that is where Nagamese has come about. Nagamese is an Assamese based pidgin where the structure of Nagamese is taken from Assamese and Indo-Aryan language, and the vocabulary items are provided by both Assamese as well as the different Naga languages, the speakers of which use Nagamese as a lingua franca. Lingua franca basically means a link language, and many languages in the world are used for such purposes that when speakers have to talk to each other and they do not have a common language, they make use of a link language. In many situations, English acts as a lingua franca for speakers of different languages. Now coming to the other pidgin used in India, Sadhari in Jharkhand, the situation is again similar. We have tribal languages, Mundari, Santhali, Ho, spoken by Austroasiatic speakers. We have languages like Malto and Kurukh spoken by Dravidian speakers who again do not understand each other's language, and none of their languages have had government patronage in the past so as to dominate the other's language, and thus came into being a Hindi based pidgin called Sadhari. Though we have said that these languages have not come about in situations of conquest, however, the imbalance of power is quite evident even in the case of these pidgins. Now, Nagamese is used by Naga language speakers who are all speakers of Tibeto-Burman languages, but Nagamese is based on one of the dominant Indo-Aryan languages in the vicinity, that is Assamese. We said Sadhari is used by speakers of Austroasiatic Munda languages and Dravidian languages, but the pidgin is once again based on a dominant Indo-Aryan neighboring language, Hindi. Thus, we see that the creation of pidgins in Creoles, even if not in situations of colonial conquest, are often the result of a certain imbalance in power. What are the other consequences of language contact? In terms of other consequences of language contact, we talk about language maintenance, language shift, and language loss, or even language death. When speakers of languages which are not privileged are put in a direct conflict situation with languages which are privileged, it very often happens that speakers of the less privileged languages find that their languages have no economic viability. It provides them with no jobs. It is no more used as a language of education. In such situations, speakers of these languages, in the context of India, especially tribal languages, which are spoken in regions where Hindi is spoken, are often seen to give up their mother tongues in favor of Hindi due to these factors of economic viability and prestige. This is a situation which is known as language shift. If accompanied by negative feelings of inferiority, if accompanied by feelings of no viability, what often happens is that parents stop transmitting the language to the next generation. A language can only survive as long as it has different domains of use. And by domains of use, we mean the domain of home, domain of education, domain of the marketplace, domain of the playground, domain of education. Now, what happens most of the times in situations of language contact is that all languages do not have equal access to all these domains of use. But mother tongues survive as long as they remain in the domain of home. But when parents begin to develop this sense of uselessness of their language, they stop transmitting the mother tongue even in the domain of home, replacing it with the language that they consider is more economically viable and superior to their own. It is in these situations that languages die. Languages most of the times do not die because speakers of the language have died. Languages mostly die because speakers have stopped transmitting it from one generation to the next generation. We see that among the other consequences of language contact are proficient users of language, where we see situations of code mixing and code switching, where unlike a situation of Pidgin and Creole, which shows kind of improper learning of the language, code mixing and code switching is possible only for such speakers who are proficient users of the language. A sentence like "Mujhe botanical gardens में घूमना अच्छा लगता है, you should also go there if you have time," is an instance of using a word like botanical gardens in a structure which is purely that of Hindi. And this is what we understand as code switching. Or if we say "tumhe chance mile to tum bhi jana," the use of chance in a structure which is purely Hindi is what we understand as code mixing. However, a sentence in between, like "if you get a chance you should also visit," would be an instance of code mixing. So we see that in situations of contact, different kinds of influences may be exerted. One could be that of creation of Pigeons and Creoles. One could be where speakers are so proficient that they mix and switch languages, and one could be where there is an eventual loss and death of languages. To conclude, we should say that we have to take situations of language shift very seriously, because language use or the right to use one's own language is today considered a basic human right. It is part of the linguistic rights of individuals to have the freedom to be educated in the language that they are most proficient in. Whereas what happens in most situations of contact is that speakers of the lesser privileged languages are often forced to complete their education or to undergo education in languages which are not their own. Thus, we find that there is a loss of a native vocabulary, loss of terms which are connected to ethnobiology, and many other things that happen detrimental to the vitality of the less privileged languages. So when we talk about situations of contact and situations of conflict, we have to understand that planners of language have to take this issue very seriously and have to understand the kind of negative impact that different policies on language have had and will have on languages of the lesser privileged, languages which are not considered economically viable, languages which the speakers of a language very unwillingly give up. Thank you.